The galactic concord was built on language. Not warships, not armies, not the kind of force that empires of the past had trusted, but on words. Every species that joined the concord brought with them their tongues, their lexicons, their peculiar ways of shaping thought. From the guttural clicks of the Sith to the pheromonal symphonies of the Arch-Hen, every mode of communication had been painstakingly charted, broken down, and reassembled into the Grand Archive. The archive was not merely a dictionary, it was a monument. Its scholars held the near-religious belief that no thought was untranslatable. For if words were the essence of a people, then translation was the bridge that turned strangers into allies. The Concord had survived for millennia precisely because no culture's essence was left unrendered, no concept too alien to find a counterpart. So when Earth petitioned for membership, the linguists prepared themselves with a mixture of curiosity and confidence. Humanity, after all, was provincial compared to the great civilizations of the stars. They had only recently reached beyond their own moon, and while they possessed a curious resilience, the Concord assumed their languages would prove simple enough to chart. At first, this assumption seemed correct. Human words poured into the archive with a satisfying ease. Mother, father, hunger, trade, peace, war. These terms had clear equivalents in nearly every species' speech. Even idioms, those supposedly untranslatable fragments of culture, could be mapped with surprising clarity once context was provided. A phrase like shooting for the stars caused brief confusion until scholars realized it was an aspirational metaphor, mirrored almost perfectly by the Keln expression to leap toward the unreachable. Branch. The linguists began to congratulate themselves. Humanity's language was diverse, yes, but not impenetrable. The archive grew fatter with Terran entries each day. Soon, it was assumed, Earth's application would proceed without issue, and then the translators encountered a peculiar word. At first it seemed straightforward. The automated systems proposed equivalents: soldier, mounted warrior, armed retainer. The words fit. Partially. Yet every time one of these translations was presented to the human delegates, they shook their heads. Not quite, said the Terran ambassador. A woman named Reyes. She spoke calmly, with the kind of patience that frustrated her interlocutors. You're circling it. But that's not what a knight is. The machines recalculated. Guardian, noble fighter, oath-bound protector. Still wrong. A Zyran linguist whose people boasted one of the oldest lexicons in the archive pressed her further. Is a knight a class of soldier in your history? A hereditary rank? A religious title? All of those things, Reyes admitted, and none of them. A knight isn't just a role. It's an idea the scholars balked. Ideas could always be broken down. They had translated the salient concept of Madra, which combined the notions of motherhood, seasonal renewal, and communal memory. They had unraveled the fear compound Katamara, a single word meaning the glory achieved by falling honorably in futile resistance. No idea was too dense, too unique, but every attempt to render night in another tongue ended in dissatisfaction. The word shifted under analysis like quicksilver. In one context, it meant a man on horseback, in steel armor, sworn to fealty. In another, it was a paragon of virtue, a figure from ancient romance who may never have existed at all. In still another, it was simply a title of respect, divorced from war altogether. The archive's algorithms failed. Scholars began heated debates. Was knight merely an obsolete curiosity, a medieval quirk with no true modern significance? Or was it something larger, something that resisted translation because it carried not just one definition but an entire philosophy? Through it all, Ambassador Reyes remained frustratingly enigmatic. She listened, as scholars argued, sometimes amused, sometimes solemn. When asked directly for the correct translation, she only shook her head. There isn't one, she said at last. The human word knight cannot be translated. You'll have to understand it the hard way. Her answer spread through the Concord like a riddle. A single word that defied translation. Impossible. The archive had no gaps, no mysteries, and yet here was one a whole, at the center of the new lexicon. A word that demanded not analysis, but experience. For the first time in living memory, the Concord scholars were faced with the possibility that their central axiom that all thoughts could be translated might not hold true, and that possibility left them deeply, profoundly unsettled. The failure to translate night became the single most discussed topic in the galactic Concord. What had begun as a linguistic curiosity swiftly grew into a controversy that spanned star systems at first. The problem was treated as a minor stumbling block. The archive contained entire committees dedicated to lexical anomalies, and most such anomalies were resolved within weeks. Yet weeks became months, and night refused to yield. The stubborn word began to take on a mythic quality, whispered about in universities and debated in symposiums. Conferences were convened. Linguists from across the Concord gathered in glittering orbital halls, their bodies and voices as varied as the stars themselves. Holograms shimmered with historical depictions of Terran knights, armored figures astride beasts of muscle and bone, banners snapping in wind, swords gleaming in sunlight. Each culture attempted to bend the image toward their own framework of meaning. Clearly, a knight is a warrior of rank, declared Professor Kerr of the Fear, whose people valued hierarchical military orders. He gestured with a claw toward an image of a mounted knight charging across a battlefield. These humans placed individuals above the common soldier, granting them status, wealth, and specialized training. The word is nothing more than their term for a professional warrior caste. Too narrow, countered Trin, a linguist of the Jath, whose long, translucent body coiled uneasily in the low-gravity chamber. The historical texts are filled with references to oaths, to bonds of service. A knight is not merely a warrior. It is one bound to obey, to serve lord or king. Without that element of submission, the word loses meaning. Others disagreed still. A Zyran scholar, with crystalline limbs that chimed faintly as they moved, raised their voice. You are both trapped in the past. Look instead to the stories humans tell. In their legends, the knight is not a servant, but a hero and embodiment of justice and courage. They protect the innocent battle monsters and uphold virtues. Surely night is less about history than about myth, an aspirational symbol. Arguments flared. Some insisted night was a relic, a fossilized word tied to obsolete feudal systems. Others argued that humans had carried the term forward, reshaping it into a cultural archetype. Still others pointed to modern usage, chess pieces, honorific titles, even ceremonial awards given to scientists and artists. How could one word contain so many contradictory roles? The debates grew more heated with each passing month. Translations were proposed, voted on, discarded. Mounted noble, warrior servant, defender sworn by oath. Each captured a sliver of meaning, but left the whole incomplete. In desperation, teams of Concord scholars immersed themselves in human literature. They read of King Arthur and his round table, of Don Quixote tilting at windmills, of knights both noble and foolish. They examined children's tales where knights slew dragons, and history texts where knights slaughtered peasants. The more they studied, the less clear the picture became. The most frustrating discovery was that humans themselves could not agree. Some described knights with reverence, others with cynicism, still others with nostalgia. One human historian bluntly told the scholars, a knight was often just a thug with land rights. Yet another insisted, a knight was an ideal, a person who lived by honor even when the world did not. The Concord, which prided itself on precision, found this ambiguity intolerable. Words were supposed to have boundaries, yet knights seemed to spill over every edge, refusing to be pinned down. Ambassador Reyes, always calm amidst the storm, gave no clarifications. She attended the debates as an observer, never as a participant. Once, when pressed, she only said, a knight is a promise. But promises don't always look the same. That cryptic answer only deepened the quarrels. Some scholars accused the humans of obscurantism, deliberately clouding meaning for prestige. Others suggested cultural arrogance, that Terrans simply enjoyed the idea of possessing a word no one else could grasp. But beneath the professional pride and academic quarrels ran a deeper current of unease. If night could not be translated, then the central dogma of the archive that all thoughts were translatable was in jeopardy. What other words, what other truths might also be beyond reach? And so, the debates dragged on. In libraries orbiting gas giants, in meeting chambers carved into asteroids, in virtual forums connecting thousands of minds, the question echoed, what, truly, is a knight? The Krav were no strangers to the Concord. They were tolerated on the periphery, violent, proud, and unpredictable. Their culture valued conquest, and though they had signed the treaties of peace, many suspected they viewed the Concord not as a union of equals, but as prey too vast to consume all at once. Raids against border systems were not uncommon. But the incident at Varanine was different. Varanine was a mixed colony, home to a fragile community of species still learning to coexist. Human settlers had been assigned there as part of their probationary integration. Farmers, engineers, and researchers made up the bulk of their number. Few soldiers were stationed nearby. The planet was considered safe. When the Krav descended, safety evaporated. Their warships shattered the orbital defenses in ours. Drop shuttles rained down, disgorging armored warriors into farming towns and research outposts. Civilians scattered, crying for help. Concord fleets were mobilized, but the nearest reinforcements were days away. On the ground, panic reigned. Families of many species huddled in shelters, barricading doors with whatever they could find. The Krav advanced relentlessly, seizing supplies and enslaving any they captured. It was a scene the Concord had seen before, a defenseless colony awaiting rescue. Praying the warships would arrive in time, but on Varanine, something unusual happened. The human settlers who had no orders, no command structure, and no real weapons beyond hunting rifles and repurposed mining tools chose not to hide. A mechanic named Callan rigged old farm haulers with armor plating. A teacher named Marathi distributed blades forged from agricultural cutters. A retired historian, Dr. Ellis, stood in the settlement square and asked for volunteers. They did not call themselves soldiers. They did not even call themselves militia. But when the first Krav patrol advanced on their settlement, they met it head-on. The battle was small, brutal, and hopeless. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and untrained. Yet they fought not to win, but to hold to, by time for the children and elders to flee deeper into the hills. A dozen fell in the first clash, but their stand rattled the Krav, who were accustomed to prey that ran, not prey that bared its teeth. Word of the resistance spread quickly. Across the colony, scattered bands of humans rose in the same spirit. They hijacked cargo haulers, turning them into battering rams. They built makeshift barricades from irrigation pipes. They launched raids not for conquest but to rescue trapped civilians of every species. The Concord observers trapped on the surface, it was bewildering. They watched as untrained Terrans hurled themselves into hopeless skirmishes. One officer, a Zyran named Koresh, recorded hours of footage in one sequence. A single human bleeding, exhausted. Shield arms shattered, stood between a group of alien children and a towering Krav warlord. The human's weapon was broken. He raised only his battered shield. He did not retreat. He did not beg. He simply stood, defiant, knowing what would come. The Krav struck him down, but not before reinforcements arrived and drove the raiders back. The children lived. Koresh, who had studied the debates on night, I see it now. The improvised defenders of Varanine held out long enough for the Concord fleet to arrive. By then, dozens of human settlers had fallen. Their names were etched hastily into stone markers in the soil they had chosen to defend. None of them were professional warriors. Yet their resistance had changed everything. When the survivors were evacuated, scholars descended once more, as this time not into libraries, but into the aftermath of battle. They interviewed the rescued civilians, who spoke in awe of the humans. "They stood for us," said a Jath child. "They didn't even know us, but they stood." The word night. Until then, a frustrating puzzle began to take shape not in theory but in memory. In the images of bloodied settlers who chose to protect strangers, the archive recorded the testimonies, footage, the names of the fallen, and though translations were still proposed, None seemed necessary anymore. The aftermath of Varanine rippled across the Concord like a shockwave. Officially, the raid was classified as a border incident, another example of Krava aggression checked by the timely arrival of the fleet. But everyone knew the truth. The fleet had been late. The colony had survived not because of the Concord's protection, but because of the defiance of untrained settlers. Most of them human, the archive received endless recordings and testimonies. Concord scholars, who had once wrestled with night in the abstract, now had living examples burned into their memory. The word no longer floated as a riddle in scholarly halls. It stood embodied in blood, sacrifice, and defiance. Yet the debates did not end immediately. In fact, they flared brighter than ever. Some insisted the human's actions proved the earlier translation. Knight was simply warrior. Or guardian. What else could it mean, if not those who took up arms to protect others? Others argued the opposite. A Jath scholar, reviewing footage of a human who had died shielding alien children, hissed in frustration. No soldier fights like this. Soldiers are bound by orders, by strategy. These humans acted without command, without any hope of victory. They fought not because they were told, but because they could not do otherwise. That is not warrior. That is something different. A Zyran historian added quietly, "We have words for honor, for sacrifice, for guardianship. But this combines them in ways that do not align with any single concept. Look at how they speak of those who fell. Not as fools, not as martyrs, but as something higher. They say, 'He was a knight.' And in that phrase lies reverence." I cannot translate. The scholars revisited human history with fresh eyes. Where once the armored figures of medieval Earth seemed quaint relics, now they took on new weight. The oath-bound riders who swore to protect. The legendary heroes who tilted against impossible odds. The flawed men and women who strove toward an unreachable ideal suddenly. All of it carried resonance. The humans themselves offered little clarification. When pressed, Ambassador Reyes smiled with a kind of sadness. "A knight isn't a profession anymore," she explained. "It's an inheritance, a story we told ourselves for centuries. The word survived because we wanted it to. Because sometimes when we need to remind ourselves what courage looks like, we still use it." She paused, her gaze steady. "And when some of our people stood on Varanine with nothing but broken tools and their word to protect strangers, we called them knights too. Not because they wore armor. Not because they followed some ancient code. But because in that moment, they lived the promise. That word promise spread through the Concord's academies like a key. Suddenly, the debates shifted. A knight was not just a warrior, nor merely a servant, nor solely a hero. A knight was one who promised to stand between the helpless and the darkness. Regardless of the cost, this, the scholars realized, was why no translation sufficed. Every species had terms for duty, for honor, for guardianship. But knight was not one of these things alone. It was all of them, braided together, reinforced by centuries of human culture and myth. A word at once historical, aspirational, and personal. And it was more than that. It was aspirational across species. The alien civilians who had been saved by human settlers began to adopt the word themselves. They spoke of their protectors with awe, the Knights of Varanine. In their mouths, the word carried no translation. They used it whole, unaltered, recognizing instinctively that to render it into their own tongues would weaken it, for the first time in its long history. The archive recorded a word that would remain untranslated. Scholars, once outraged by the notion, accepted it now with humility in the great chambers of the Concord. An official declaration was made. The human word knight resists equivalence. It signifies not merely warrior, not merely servant, not merely hero. It signifies a covenant of protection, sacrifice, and virtue. No single word in any other tongue may contain its meaning. Therefore, it shall be preserved untranslated within the archive, that all may learn it as the humans speak it. There was silence in the chamber when the declaration was read. Then, one by one, voices from a dozen species repeated the word aloud. It rang strangely in their varied throats, sometimes awkward, sometimes elegant, but always solemn. night. The word night did not fade after Varanine. Instead, it spread. Slowly at first, whispered by survivors and recorded in scholarly archives. Then faster, as stories carried it from system to system. It became more than a human curiosity. It became a banner. The Concord, in its long history, had seen many words pass between cultures. Most were easily absorbed, translated and reshaped to fit new tongues. But night was different. Attempts to render it in alien languages felt hollow, stripped of essence. Civilians rescued on Varanine refused to call their defenders anything else. They told their children it was the humans, the knights, who stood for us, and the children repeated it with reverence. At first, the Concord's academies hesitated. Was it proper to elevate a foreign word to such prominence? But resistance dwindled quickly. The survivors spoke with such conviction that even the most stubborn linguists could not deny the resonance. Eventually, the archive sealed its decision. The word would remain untranslated. It would stand in every dictionary exactly as humans spoke at night. From there, its meaning grew. In the following years, whenever someone human or alien acted with extraordinary courage in defense of others, the word was invoked. A fierce soldier who threw himself into the breach so civilians could escape was hailed as a knight. A Jath medic who refused evacuation till every wounded patient was safe earned the same title. Even when the word was mispronounced by tongues unsuited for Terran syllables, its power was undiminished. What struck many scholars was how the word reshaped those who adopted it. For the humans, night was centuries old, a mixture of history and legend. For others, it was new, a gift from a younger species, adopted without baggage. They carried it not as a burden of tradition, but as a living standard ambassador. Reyes observed the change with quiet satisfaction. In an address to the Concord Assembly, she explained, "When my ancestors spoke of knights, they spoke of men in armor on horseback, but the armor rusted and the horses died. What survived was not the form, but the spirit. To us, a knight became anyone who chose to defend what could not defend itself, even at terrible cost. That spirit does not belong to humanity alone. It belongs to anyone who is willing to bear it." The assembly chamber was silent for a long moment. Then, as if in echo, voices from dozens of species repeated the word aloud, awkward, solemn, powerful. Night in time, the word crossed even into military doctrine. Some Concord defense forces began to form night units, not elite soldiers in the traditional sense, but volunteers trained for rapid response, sworn to prioritize the protection of civilians above all else. These units included humans, yes, but also Zyrons, Jath, Fear, and others. They carried different weapons, different banners, but all bore a single shared name. To many, the adoption of a human word felt symbolic. Humanity was still a young member of the Concord, untested in the grand currents of galactic politics. Yet this one gift, a word that encapsulated more than law, more than rank, more than culture, became a thread binding countless peoples together. The Krav, of course, scoffed. To them, night was weakness, masquerading as honor. They mocked the Concord for clinging to a Terran fairy tale. But even their scorn carried an edge of unease, for they had seen the settlers of Varanine firsthand. They had learned that those who called themselves knights did not run, even when reason said they should. Generations later, the word remained. It was etched into monuments on Varanine, not only in Terran script, but in a dozen alien tongues spelling the same human word. Statues of ordinary settlers stood with shields raised, not as conquerors, but as protectors. Pilgrims came to see them, not just humans, but species from across the Concord seeking to understand what it meant to be a knight in their own lives. For children born long after the battle, night was a story told at bedtime, a hope whispered before difficult journeys. For soldiers, it was a reminder that their duty was not conquest, but defense. For civilians, it was a word that meant safety, even in the darkest hours. And always the word was left untranslated, because translation would diminish it. To call it warrior or guardian or protector was to lose the spark that made it whole. Only the human word carried the full weight of promise. Thus, across the stars, in markets and palaces, in battlefields and classrooms, the word echoed night, and in every throat, no matter the species, it meant the same thing: to stand, to shield, to sacrifice, to be more than a word, to be a promise.